This is the Boox Go 6 Gen 2, and on paper it looks like a small update at first. Slightly nicer design, more RAM, different back. But then Boox added pen support and suddenly this tiny Android e-reader becomes something much more interesting. One of the smallest e-ink note takers you can buy with a wide aspect ratio. No, that 6-inch display won't replace a proper notebook. But for reading quick annotations and small notes on the go, this makes way more sense than it probably should. So let's talk about what Boox got right and where they made some strange choices. Starting with the design, the Boox Go 6 Gen 2 keeps that very compact 6-inch form factor. And that's one of the biggest strengths here. It's the kind of e-reader you can't just throw into a bag, carry around all day, and barely notice. Compared to the first generation, Boox did change the shape a bit though, and I think it's a clear improvement. The corners and edges are more rounded now, and that makes the whole thing feel much nicer in the hand. The previous more clean-cut style was fine, but this feels more comfortable, more natural, and just a little more polished. The back also got this new style with these small bumps. It gives the device a nicer feel, but after using the device without the cover, can show a bit of wear relatively quickly. And because the material itself is quite smooth, it can also feel a little slippery. Overall, I'd still call the new back design a nice improvement, because this is the kind of subtle refinement that makes a device nicer to use every day. On the front, you get a flush display with a very subtle paper-like texture. And that's nice because it gives the screen a slightly more pleasant feel when writing than a completely smooth glass layer. But it also means the top layer is not the same scratch-resistant front you got on the first generation. So don't make the same mistake I did and take a cutter knife to the display, assuming it would handle that as well as before. Because, well, it doesn't. And despite the small size and light build, the Go 6 Gen 2 does feel solid. There's no creaking, no strange flexing. With 7mm thickness, it's ever so slightly thicker than in the official specs, but thin enough to handle easily. At 160 grams, the Boox Go 6 Gen 2 is extremely lightweight. Holding it for longer reading sessions is effortless. And that's really the practical takeaway here. It's thin, compact, and very comfortable to use. Another thing worth pointing out on a device like this is the available storage. The official specs lists it at 32 gigs, which is true. But the operating system takes up almost 10 gigs of that. So that's something to keep in mind. To be fair, over 20 gigs of available space is still plenty for most people, and you still get the microSD card expansion, which is always a win. Compared to the previous generation, the RAM got upgraded from 2 gigs to 3 gigs on the Boox Go 6 Gen 2. That's obviously still less than the larger Boox devices have, but for a small e-ink e-reader, that's typically enough for what you'll do on a device like this. We already know the Snapdragon 662 SoC from other Boox devices, and it's also easily capable enough for typical e-reader tasks. Opening books, using the built-in reading app, Kindle, PDFs, the Notes app, and many other apps work just fine. Display-wise, there's one detail that makes this device a little harder to pin down than I'd like. The old Boox Go 6 product page specifically listed e-ink Carta 1300 as the display technology. Carta 1300 is considered one of the best e-ink technologies right now when it comes to contrast and readability. On the new Boox Go 6 Gen 2 product page, Boox doesn't mention Carta 1300 anymore. This makes me suspect that maybe not every market gets the same display tech, or that Boox is using a different panel altogether this time around. My own measurements kind of point in that direction as well. Using the spectrophotometer, the background measures slightly darker than on the first generation Go 6. I'm getting an L-star value of around 65 to 66 compared to roughly 66 to 67 on the older model. L-star is basically a measure of lightness. The higher the number, the brighter a surface appears. To be clear, this is not a huge difference. It's honestly hard to spot even when you put both devices side by side. In practical terms, I don't think this changes the experience dramatically. Text still looks sharp thanks to the 300 ppi resolution, contrast is very good, and as a compact black and white e-reader, the Boox Go 6 Gen 2 does the most important thing very well. But it does make the display story a little less clean than I'd like. There's a color temperature adjustable Frontlight, which lets you use the e-reader in basically any lighting condition. Frontlight quality is nice overall, but at the highest setting of a pretty insane 230 nits, there's a noticeable brightness gradient from top to bottom, which gets less obvious when adjusting the Frontlight to more reasonable levels. The lowest Frontlight setting gets down to around 0.15 nits, which is dim enough to not get blinded in the dark. Light halos are slightly more visible at the bottom of the screen, but besides those, the Frontlight is a bit more even than on the first gen. Ghosting performance is well controlled most of the time, but it can also be very noticeable depending on what you're doing. That actually makes me think there might be a Carta 1300 panel in here after all, because that technology can be a little more prone to ghosting than some other generations. In case you don't know the term, ghosting is when faint traces of the previous screen still appear after changing the content. Because e-ink displays physically move particles inside the panel and some can get stuck temporarily, that's why you see those brief flashes with e-ink from time to time. And that brings us to usability, because this is where Boox devices always become a bit more interesting and also a bit more complicated. The Boox Go 6 Gen 2 runs Android 11, and that is both great for added flexibility, but also a bit of a letdown. Now, to be fair, for a device that is primarily an e-reader, you don't necessarily need the newest Android version. Most reading apps work fine, and if your main use case is just reading books and occasionally writing something down, Android 11 won't suddenly ruin the experience. But security-wise and longevity-wise, this old version of Android is simply worse than it should be at this point. Just for context, Google is releasing version 17 this year. What makes Android even viable to use on an e-ink screen long-term is Boox's e-ink control center called InkWise. It allows you to adjust the e-ink refresh behavior and speed at the cost of image quality and clarity, and you can do that on an app-by-app basis. So if an app needs a higher refresh rate, you can easily switch to that faster e-ink mode. Many apps you typically run on an e-ink screen work fine automatically without the need to adjust settings. But if you ever need it, the options are here. There's a bit of a learning curve to those settings and also to using the Boox Go 6 Gen 2 in general. But if you're willing to spend a little time getting to know the device, it's also not too complicated. Just don't expect the simplicity of a Kindle, Kobo, or Pocketbook e-reader. The home screen uses the typical Boox layout, with the library, store, notes, storage, apps, and settings links at the bottom. It's not the most elegant interface in the world, but it's fairly clear. And once you understand how Boox organizes things, it's easy enough to navigate. You can use gesture navigation, or you can show the navigation bar at the bottom of the screen. Personally, I still prefer the navigation bar on e-ink, because e-ink always has that little bit of visual delay. Visible buttons just feel more predictable to me. The library has useful sorting and filtering options, and Boox also gives you plenty of cloud sync options for services like Google Drive, Dropbox, OneDrive, WebDAV, Evernote, and some Chinese options as well. That's a nice feature, especially if you move books, PDFs, or documents between multiple devices. The built-in store is a different story. It's called a store, but it's not really a store in the Kindle or Kobo sense. It's basically a collection of public domain books. That's nice to have, and I'm not against it. But if you're expecting a full bookstore with contemporary literature, this is not that. You'll need to get your books from somewhere else. Thankfully, because this is Android, that's not a huge issue. You can install Kindle, Kobo, Libby, or basically whatever reading workflow you already use. That flexibility is the main reason to buy an Android e-reader over something more locked down. However, it's worth pointing out that some of these app options essentially mean that you still stay in that golden cage of another company, despite running the app on an open e-reader. For DRM-free ebooks, the built-in reading app is a very capable option. Inside Boox, you get a lot of control over the reading experience. You can adjust text size, font weight, word spacing, line spacing, paragraph spacing, and page margins. There's really not much more I would ask for when it comes to basic text customization. Boox also cleaned up the layout of these settings a while back. They look more refined now and less cramped than before, though there are still plenty of things to discover. The dictionary situation is a little mixed. By default, Boox now leans on an online dictionary, and for quick definitions in English, that works fine. You can also use local dictionaries, but only 3 are pre-installed and 2 of those are Chinese. That leaves you to search for compatible dictionaries yourself. So that's exactly what I meant before. It's just not the kind of guided, easy-to-use experience you get from a Kindle, Kobo, or Pocketbook e-reader. Translation inside Boox is more useful. Bing, Google, and Onyx are available as translation providers, and you can also quickly look up a word in Wiktionary. If you're reading in another language or switching between different kinds of texts, having dictionary, translation, and Wiktionary access directly in the reading flow makes the Boox Go 6 Gen 2 feel a bit more capable than some of the competition. You can also highlight text and add annotations to pinned notes, but because Boox is constantly adding and adapting features, which is generally nice, you'll occasionally encounter issues like this, where you can't remove a highlight or add a note to it. It's also possible to annotate ebooks directly using the Stylus, which works well, but the small screen is definitely a limitation that's more noticeable here. because there's typically not a lot of white space for your notes. You also need to keep in mind that EPUB files are reflowable, and changing the style can realign your annotations inside the book. Though Boox does a really good job keeping things relatively stable if you're not changing too many styling options at the same time. PDF handling is still one of Boox's biggest strengths, and the Boox Go 6 Gen 2 benefits from those Boox features a lot. Viewing PDFs in the Boox reading app is still the best experience you can get on e-ink right now. And obviously a 6-inch screen is not ideal for PDFs, and I don't want to pretend it is, no matter how good the software is. If you read scientific papers or large format documents all day, get a larger device. But you get several very useful viewing modes on the Boox Go 6 Gen 2, making it an incredibly capable PDF reader. And I'm not getting tired of pointing this out, but columns mode is still my favorite. That mode zooms in on a portion of the page and then jumps from segment to segment, so you don't have to constantly pinch, pan, and manually reposition the page. For multi-column scientific papers, that can make a document surprisingly readable even on a compact screen like this. And that's also where the Go 6 Gen 2 is better than the Palm-aligned, because the phone-shaped e-readers from Boox miss those PDF viewing modes entirely. Again, this does not magically turn a 6-inch e-reader into a Note Max, but it does make the Go 6 Gen 2 much more useful for occasional PDFs than pretty much any other small e-reader. And thanks to the hardware, even larger and more complex files didn't cause major issues in my testing. Now, the biggest new feature is obviously pen support. The Boox Go 6 Gen 2 works with the optionally available capacitive InkSense Plus stylus and gives this tiny device proper note-taking capabilities. So if you want that, you'll need to order the stylus separately. The pen itself is made of metal, has a good weight to it, and it feels comfortable in the hand. There's also a button on the side which you can use for erasing strokes quickly instead of constantly switching tools in software. And because this is a capacitive pen, not a Wacom EMR stylus, it needs to be charged, in this case separately via USB-C. That's the same kind of trade-off we've seen on other small devices with pen support. And because there's also no magnetic attachment on the device itself or a loop on the official cover, the whole pen setup is not the most convenient one. So you're basically carrying a loose stylus, which is not ideal for a device that's supposed to be this portable. But of course, the screen size is the obvious limitation. A 6-inch display is not a great canvas for long handwritten notes, detailed planning, diagrams, or anything where you want a lot of space. So this does not replace a larger Boox tablet, a Remarkable Paper Pure, a Kindle Scribe, or anything in that category. The more interesting comparison is actually something like the Remarkable Paper Pro Move, because I always found that device a little strangely positioned. It's supposed to be more portable, but because of that taller aspect ratio, it's still awkward to put in pockets or carry around casually. So it ends up in this weird middle zone where it's smaller than a full-size notebook device, but not really pocketable either. And yes, you can rotate the Paper Pro Move by 90 degrees to get more horizontal writing space. I get the idea. But in everyday use, I just don't think that shape makes much sense most of the time. The Go 6 Gen 2 doesn't magically give you a huge writing canvas. The horizontal writing space is still small, obviously, but the shape makes a lot more sense to me, because it lands in a much nicer middle ground. It's not as pocketable as the Boox Palm-aligned, of course, but compared to the Remarkable Paper Pro Move, it's easier and more comfortable to carry around. And honestly, this is much closer to what I think the Paper Pro Move should have been in the first place, just with a proper pen mounting solution added. Pen accuracy is also pretty decent and noticeably better than what the Boox Go 7 delivers with the regular InkSense pen. I also tested it against the Go 7 using the pointier InkSense Plus pen. And to keep the comparison as consistent as possible, I used my handwriting robot for that. Even then, the Go 6 Gen 2 handled tight curves a little better, which is important when writing letters like M, N, V, or W. But of course, same as with pretty much all capacitive pens, you get that slight diagonal wobble. But to be fair, it's a lot less pronounced than on many other USI-compatible devices I've used. Still, keep it in mind if you like to sketch. For normal note-taking, it's not really an issue though. Pen latency was honestly the biggest surprise for me. In my testing, I measured around 19 milliseconds, which obviously isn't record-breaking anymore. At this point, we've seen more and more e-ink devices getting closer to 10 milliseconds. So this is not a new benchmark, but it's still a very decent result. And 2 years ago, 19 milliseconds would have been enough to put the Go 6 Gen 2 near the top of the e-ink latency charts.
What makes it surprising is the form factor. I just didn't expect a small 6-inch capacitive pen device like this to feel this responsive. It's basically as quick as the remarkable Paper Pure, which is a bit crazy when you think about how different these devices are supposed to be. So in actual use, writing feels responsive and natural. Boox gives you a very complete note-taking app. You get different pen types, pressure support where it makes sense, layers, templates, shapes, audio recording, and interlinking features. There's also the outline tool, which lets you build a table of contents inside a notebook, and that outline is preserved when you export your notes as a PDF. As I said, on a 6-inch screen, all of this is obviously a little cramped. But the fact that the same core note-taking system is here at all is what makes the Go 6 Gen 2 stand out. You can also sync notes to the cloud and choose between servers in the EU, the US, or China. According to Onyx's privacy policy, they comply with European data protection standards. Still, just like with other Boox devices, there is some background communication with Boox servers going on. And I really wish they would give users a clear option to fully disable that. To be fair, this kind of behavior is not entirely unusual for Android-based systems. Android is a pretty chatty operating system in general. Battery life is probably the one weak spot you might actually notice in everyday use. The Go 6 Gen 2 only has a 1500 mAh battery, and that just doesn't result in especially good runtimes. For pure reading, with the Frontlight turned off, I measured roughly 16 hours on a single charge, and in my handwriting robot test, it managed about 6 hours. So if you turn up the Frontlight, use a lot of Android apps, or generally treat this more like a tiny tablet, then a simple e-reader runtimes will be even lower. And that's probably the weakest point in what is otherwise a really solid performance, especially because the first gen managed to get slightly better runtimes. It's not disastrous for such a small and flexible device, but it is something to keep in mind if you expect classic e-reader battery life.
As a simple 6-inch Android e-reader, it's already very strong. It's compact, light, comfortable, expandable and flexible thanks to Android. But the pen support pushes it into a more unique category. It's not just competing with other small e-readers. It's kind of creating this tiny e-ink notebook category, where the value is in having something this small can do this much. The reading app is powerful, the PDF handling is far better than you would expect on a screen this small, and actually good pen support makes the device much more flexible. And then you have the weaker parts. The Android 11 situation is not great. The display specification is less transparent than it should be, and battery life is also not the best. And the learning curve is also steeper than the more traditional devices from Kindle, Kobo or Pocketbook. And with a price of €200 or dollars, excluding the pen, it's also not especially cheap. But it's definitely still one of the most interesting small e-ink devices Boox has made, and worth a closer look. Like and subscribe if you found this review helpful. Thanks for spending your time watching, and let's see you on the next one.